So, the topic tonight, which I am so pleased to be talking about, I think this is a fascinating
Yeah,
topic.
I agree.
Yeah, we're talking about Black purity culture tonight. So, we're talking about sexuality that is specific to the Black community. Of course, we're talking about
Mhm.
the American Black community. We're
Mhm.
talking about what we know about.
Right.
Uh, so what is purity culture from a Black perspective, as far as you know? Because we know this is a Christian thing,
Mhm.
but are there are there differences that are specific to the Black community in your experience, Jenna?
I would say there is. Growing up, I won't say born, but I was raised Christian in a Christian household. I am myself identify as a closeted atheist. So anyone outside of the sphere of the internet does not know that I am atheist. But with the experience I have grown up on, what I have been told and taught from family and church family, I guess you could say, there is just this heavy strain of, or I could say heavy rule, which is not too much far pulled from the Christian Bible, is that remaining pure or remaining abstinent before until you're married is like heavily driven, especially for the Black community or Black culture. So, you know, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, Rudy, in your past, but I know with my own, and I never even went through this kind of ceremony. It was something called like just exchanging or giving your young teen daughter purity rings, which is
Hmm.
essentially very odd because I never saw this for guys. I think they had a different kind of special ceremony, but my sister, who is a few years older than I, had went through this type of ceremony to where you you know. Uh, Take a vow with your parent or parents in front of the whole entire congregation, and you pray and have this kind of dialogue to where when you take a vow and oath saying you will remain, sexually pure or abstinent until you are married with your husband. And of course, the heavy strain on it being a heterosexual um, marriage. So, and I know, in my experience, or at least from what I have learned from friends, there have been other forms of this type of purity ring exchange ceremony to where it could be kind of, I don't know. I don't want to too much express it because I'm not too familiar. But with this exchange of the ring is that you're vowing to keep yourself pure and waiting until that thing where you're creating this false dichotomy of, oh, if I remain sexually abstinent, then I'll have this perfect marriage and I'm doing this under, the eyes of God, and everything beyond my life once I'm married and have my husband to take care of me and my household, everything would be great. And you're fed this false vision for yourself, um you know and you're at the same time with that false vision, you're not fed the appropriate knowledge of sexual education. So it's just a lot of dynamics that surround all of that.
Definitely, I can definitely see that. This whole purity ring thing, that's really interesting. I've heard about select cases of that, not just
Mhm.
within the Black community, but that that isn't something I have seen or heard a lot of growing up as a Jehovah's Witness,
Mm.
because I guess it's kind of just assumed that the purity is assumed, because if you don't stay pure, then you're just not a Jehovah's Witness. Like, you'll be disfellowshipped. So a vow of chastity is kind of redundant in addition to just being baptized. It's kind of included. It's a package deal, so I guess that there's never really been any need for the
Mhm.
additional purity signs. But I wouldn't be surprised if I had had some friends growing up who had things like that: purity, chastity rings, that type of thing.
Right. Yeah. I it's so funny because I never, I guess, got the appropriate chance to go through this type of ceremony, but as for myself, I'm not a virgin, and neither is my sister. Neither my sister and I are married, and so, but my sister will be married later on this year. But it's so funny how or at least in the perspective of my family, that they held on to this tradition or belief that should be abide by, because it's you're looked upon as someone that is virtuous and strong and can detract yourself or detach yourself from any type of sinful sexual desires or thoughts. And so when you uh, have yourself, when you remove yourself from that and involve yourself in sexual activity, then the change of, or I should say I don't, the wrong word is prejudice, but the um the hurtful language that you're met with, and especially if you have a child out of wedlock, it's they almost, I have seen some disownership, but also more aggressive, religious hugging, if I can put it lightly. And I say that in which they just overcrowd you with, oh, we need to get you in faith groups, we need to get you this kind of help that's, faith involved and covered in Jesus and all over that stuff. And that just further drives the indoctrination that you cannot successfully survive and not be a adequate or appropriate person, because you've already sullied yourself, and plus you've had a baby out of wedlock, so now we need to purify you all over again and put you under this blanket of God, and it just further constrains you in that light. And the other flip side is when I see older women, especially in the Black church, where if they happen to lose a spouse, or that spouse is divorced from them, or where however that happens, they continue to live this life of celibacy, and without the prospect of even really remarrying or not. And I'm like, wow, that's really debilitating, because you're supposed to, on the outside, have this picturesque view of a virtuous, a strong woman that, will not lean on those sinful desires. And I just find that just really sad. And it's no wonder that there's such a underrated percentage of depression that goes along with older Black females. And I'm
Do you
not saying
think
it's because you're without sex, but just the mere
yeah.
fact that that's honed in is part of it.
Do you think that that sort of very strong pushback and sort of like there's a stigma of hypersexualization that surrounds Black women.
Yeah.
If that's something you didn't already know, surprise, surprise, that is the case.
Whoa.
Um, do you think that that's sort of a pushback against that, to be sort of hyper pure, hyper celibate in these sort of godly puritanical Christian circles?
I want to say so. And I, through my own knowledge, because I am a nurse, so I have some medical background and some idea and understanding that with different ethnicities, different body types, even some mature faster than others. I myself hit puberty, or, I will say lightly, hit puberty at the age of 10, and I matured
Oof.
a lot quicker, and appeared appearance wise looked more mature than my age, especially once I
Mm-hmm.
hit sixth grade, which was like 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that, Black young girls and that mature into Black women, they develop consistently more earlier and faster than other ethnicities. So when you see that and then you put religion on smack down on it, it makes sense why there's such a strong hold on, you know, hampering down, like, okay, we have to, lock you into this, you know vow of celibacy before you can be touched, or, or it has to be appropriately with this said person of that same faith in order for it to be righteous, or in order for it to be seen as appropriate.
That
But
is
yeah.
oh god.
No, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
I find that really interesting because it's like just because a child is physically developing faster doesn't make them stop being a child any sooner, but they're,
Mhm.
from an earlier age than girls of other ethnicities, you're being sexualized.
Right.
You're seen as potentially a sexual being at a much younger age
Mhm.
for no other reason than being curvier, just
Right.
naturally.
Mhm.
Whew. Do you have any input or questions on this, Puck?
Yeah, I do, but see, I am remaining silent on purpose because this is the Puck listens and learns episode, right?
Well, you can't
Because
listen the whole time.
no, no, no. But I'll give you my
We
thoughts
won't
on
do
this
that.
because, I grew up in a Filipino household in a Filipino community, and I'm hearing a lot of mirrors to this. Just like Rudy was saying about the purity rings and the purity pledges, it wasn't something that you had to do because it was something that was kind of built in. It was just kind of assumed. And so, what's one more promise on top of something that's already assumed anyway? And in the Filipino culture that I grew up in, it's very difficult to separate the Filipino part from the Catholic part because just about everything that we did and everything that we knew, it revolved in some way around something that was church related also. So it's interesting for me to hear some of the parallels. And like my one story was that I had a young female relative who, at the age of 15, had been discovered with a guy, and that's fine. But what her parents decided to do was have a counseling session, not with a family counselor or anything, but with the priest of in the archdiocese to come in, invite them for dinner to have a talk about why it's very important to remain chaste.
Hmm.
So I'm seeing some interesting parallels, and I've never really thought about how different ethnic groups and racial groups deal with sexuality. And this is why this episode is super interesting for me, because it's making me look back at my own past and wonder how much of where I was brought up, the way I was brought up, was because of a cultural tradition, and how much of that was based on religious tradition.
Yeah. Even
So
drive.
this
Yeah.
is super fascinating to me. I'm full of questions, but I'm sure you've got plenty to talk about.
Right. Even driving home the point for me in my experience, because there came a time I lost my virginity when I was 18, and there came a point in time, sometime a little after that time, a couple of years after that, that I actually expressed to my mother that I did have sex, and what I don't know. It was my way of trying for us to kind of grow and bond or whatever. And, years later, even though she was, heavily disappointed, it wasn't said that nicely. But anyway, um,
Yeah.
as recent as just maybe a few months before the pandemic hit and all churches were not allowed to kind of have congregation and everything, I sat in my Sunday school with my mother and my sister, and they were kind of having this kind of discussion about women and, dialing back to Adam and Eve and all that. And, pretty much emphasizing the need and uh, being necessary for being abstinent. And then my mother just, proudly like sat up in her chair and expressed like, I am, and I'm kind of almost saying this word for word. She pretty much said to the whole room of 30 plus people, I am so proud that my adult daughters have remained pure and until they find their um, significant others or whatever. And I kind of side-eyed and looked at her. I'm like, is to be so blatantly blatantly lie and say that just to, keep up the appearance that her two adult daughters are, unmarried, still have their purity. It's just,
Purity.
it blew my mind, the significance of how big of an importance this is. I'm like, who the fuck cares? But that also dials into other things about, sexuality with Black people, especially when it comes to, homosexuality, polyamorous relationships, which I have very little knowledge of, and even if that is the most prominent thing in Black culture. But it's just scary that it's just such a stronghold with the added notion that sexual education when it comes to Black parents and their kids is almost non-existent.
Yeah, that is something that I didn't experience a lack of sexual education, but I think that that is because there is a very strong emphasis within the Jehovah's Witness community, at least, of if you don't teach your kids about sex, the world will. So I had something of a sex education. It wasn't super thorough. It certainly didn't teach me how to have sex, but it taught me pretty much everything up to that. And of course, I knew what contraceptives were. I knew how they worked, but that was stuff I mostly learned from the internet. They just didn't stop me from learning it from the internet.
Right.
So
see, you're lucky. You had the internet. I had the Encyclopedia Britannica. So when like the talk with me was going through the encyclopedia and the human anatomy section in there and having a very clinical description of the parts. This happened when I was quite young, like in early grade school. Just, this is the mechanics of the birds and the bees. And then the only other conversation that I had about that with my parents was sometime, I think I was about 12 or 13. And the basic gist of it was, you're going to want to, but don't. And that was like the beginning and end of the conversation. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Jena, was you were talking about a lot of this from a female perspective. But one thing that I noticed about the difference when I was growing up, like when my parents found out that I had sex before marriage, it was kind of seen as a disappointment, but not a huge deal was made about it. But the same could not be said for my sister, who when they found out, there was a lot more of a stir. So is there anything you've got about the difference between the ways that young women and young men are treated as far as purity culture?
Oh yeah, definitely. I have no well, I do have half brothers, but we're not close. But as far as immediate siblings, it's just my sister and I. So I don't have an immediate like brother that I visually saw the difference between, the sex talk or education for us versus them. But yes, like I had mentioned, I don't recall there being any type of ceremony growing up in church where the young boys in that church had that same type of ceremony as the girls did. So there obviously is a sexist emphasis on really tapping down on the girls, like you're the trouble. You need to, take care of it and not allow these, hooligans to mess up and put something in you. And
if I could add to that, I think
Uh-huh.
that it's not even just sexism against women, but there's also a very toxic culture of toxic masculinity within the Black community. And getting laid is masculine. So even though you're not supposed to, if you're a pure Christian man, you're not really going to get as much flack for it either. Because, well, you're supposed to.
Right.
There's I think that a lot of the, maybe not a lot of, but definitely some of the problems with, restrictive sexuality within the Black community has its roots in toxic masculinity, specifically toxic Black masculinity, the concept of what makes a Black man a man.
Oh, absolutely. Like just how aside from how society views a man and a woman, it's even more toxic, just as you said, Rudy. It's even more toxic in the Black culture too, because we're Black people are already viewed as lower, as oh, if a man is not in a home, then that home is just already a mess. And it's almost stereotypical that a man always leaves their family or never has a job or never can hold a job or never can take care of their family, yada yada yada, which also propagates the whole strong Black woman is the head of the household type deal, and that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, the idea that a Black man is not subjugated to the same type of treatment as a Black girl is when they grow up, as far as sexuality is concerned, but they hold them at a different double standard. And that double standard clearly being, the basic double standard is, oh, a guy sleeps around with a bunch of girls, they're seen as a player, versus a woman that sleeps around with a bunch of men, they're seen as a whore. And so unfortunately that it's the same type of idea I see in that Black Christian culture, but it's just said nicely or said in a nicer way.
So
Yeah.
I hear a lot of conversations about how young women are taught that their bodies are objectified by young men, and like if something happens, you'd like if you show too much skin, then a boy's not going to be able to help himself, and stuff like that. Now, coming from the male perspective, and again, I speak only for myself on this one, and my experiences growing up, but it was never like explicitly taught to me. Like, it's like those girls are going to try to get you, and they're going to try to. It wasn't that specific. It was more a sense of like the world is going to try to get you to break your purity and to break your.
But there are girls in that world.
But there are girls in that world, yes. Yeah. And that's most. But they so it's interesting to hear that it's framed so differently for the way young men are taught and the way young women are taught. This is a good learning experience for me. I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, I will say another example just and recently in the last few years, it's always in my Sunday school, always. It's just the most toxic. I have my troubles with them, but my actual one of the facilitators, he's just this proud, big, tall Black man. He and often his wife is there present too. He has consistently has mentioned that it's not his fault that his eyes are trained to look upon a beautiful woman as they walk by. I mean, obviously the woman knows what she's doing when she wears that dress or walks that way or puts on all this makeup or flips her hair or whatever. And I'm just like, that's the same propagated notion and idea that any sexist man would have. And you're automatically placing that blame on that woman for just going about her day, but you just happen to look at her and he's like, well, she knows what she's doing. That's why I can't, don't fault me for looking at her butt. She happened to just walk by with her butt out like that.
Yeah. Like she has a butt. How can I not look at it? The butt's
exactly.
there.
Exactly. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's I have seen and heard a lot of that kind of stuff. It's yuck.
Yeah.